The Eastern Front in mid-1941 carried a weight of movement unlike anything armies had seen before. Entire formations were stretched thin, supply roads buckled from overuse, and the sheer speed of the campaign forced units to adapt at a pace that often exceeded their own communication networks. What looked like clear advances on a map concealed something far more fragile on the ground. Extended lines, exposed flanks, and officers forced to make decisions with incomplete, delayed, or conflicting reports. The problem lay not only in the fighting itself, but in the tempo. Too fast for certainty, too slow for correction. Across several sectors, small gaps appeared, where units had advanced unevenly. A regiment might push forward more successfully than the one beside it, leaving a seam that widened hour by hour. These seams invited danger. A counterattack in the right place, even a modest one, could unravel momentum and expose rear positions that were never built to hold. Commanders knew this, yet they struggled to recognize where the true vulnerabilities formed until after damage was already done. By the summer of 1941, frontline maps were marked with these quiet risks. Reports described isolated platoons holding crossroads alone, supply columns forced to reroute through forest trails, and artillery batteries left without clear guidance as shifting lines disrupted their forward observers. The front was not a continuous wall. It was a series of improvisations, each dependent on the next. On one particular stretch of the line, reconnaissance officers noticed a troubling pattern. Advancing units had veered slightly off their assigned axis, creating a subtle bend. On paper, it seemed minor, but in the field, it produced a corridor of weakness, an area where infantry marched ahead faster than supporting elements could reinforce. This corridor would become the focal point of one of 1941's most decisive tactical adjustments. A maneuver that, though small in scale, carried consequences far beyond the map's narrow ink lines. The situation along the front in 1941 was shaped by several overlapping pressures. Rapid movement meant that divisions frequently found themselves beyond their planned supply cycles, forcing trucks and wagon trains into long exposed routes. Roads that had been adequate in peacetime quickly degraded under the constant passage of armored columns, artillery teams, and logistical convoys. Dust, heat, and mechanical strain slowed the very momentum the armies depended on. Amid this pace, intelligence became more difficult to interpret. Reports from reconnaissance units reflected snapshots of fluid terrain, enemy withdrawals mixed with pockets of resistance that flared unpredictably. Commanders needed to act quickly, yet hesitation risked losing the advantage gained by earlier progress. The front resembled a living structure, flexible, reactive, and uneven, shaped by terrain, fatigue, and weather as much as by orders. Furthermore, reserve formations were often too distant to intervene rapidly. A threat detected at dusk might not receive support until dawn, by which time the situation had already changed. Radio nets were stretched, field telephones lagged behind the advancing infantry, and courier riders were frequently delayed by road congestion. The fog of war thickened, not from uncertainty alone, but from the sheer velocity of events. In the midst of these challenges, sectors that appeared quiet could become volatile without warning. A shift of a few kilometers, a misaligned unit, or a delay in artillery repositioning might expose a flank inadvertently. It was within one of these fragile sectors, neither the most famous nor the most heavily fortified, that a subtle misalignment placed an entire formation at risk. Officers began to sense that the pace of operations had outstripped the structure supporting it, and that the front needed not an overhaul, but a precise, well-timed correction. Each day along this stretch of the 1941 line followed a rhythm defined by movement and correction. Infantry companies advanced cautiously through fields and scattered woodland, pausing at intervals to wait for supporting elements that struggled to maintain cohesion. Artillery units repositioned constantly, their crews laboring to keep their pieces within effective range of the fluid front. Horses, trucks, and motorcycles shared narrow roads, creating bottlenecks that slowed every attempt at synchronization. Supply officers worked relentlessly to prioritize fuel and ammunition for the units most likely to encounter resistance. They negotiated scarce resources, redirecting convoys based on fresh but often incomplete reports. A sudden request from a forward commander could ripple backward through the chain of supply, forcing adjustments that affected multiple regiments at once. Reconnaissance teams played a central role. Working ahead of the main body, they identified small bridges, fords, and crossroads that could support or hinder progress. Their observations shaped the day's tempo. A destroyed culvert might force an entire battalion to detour, while an intact forest track could shorten the march by hours. Yet the information they gathered also revealed the weaknesses forming within the line, areas where infantry had moved too far ahead or where supporting formations lagged dangerously behind. Within command posts, officers updated their maps repeatedly, marking shifts in the front with grease pencils. They struggled to maintain a coherent picture as units reported from different locations, some advancing rapidly, others stalled by terrain or resistance. The operational reality was clear. The front was no longer aligned along a single axis. Without correction, the imbalance could invite a concentrated counterstroke. It was during these daily routines of marching men, overloaded supply routes, and restless artillery that the need for a tactical maneuver became undeniable. The warning signs emerged subtly at first. Patrols returning from the forward edge described increased enemy activity near the sector where the line was already strained. Small groups were probing the gap created by the uneven advance, slipping through thickets and shallow ravines to test the responsiveness of the defenders. Commanders noted the pattern, aware that these preliminary movements often preceded a more serious attempt to exploit a weakness. The crisis deepened when an infantry battalion holding the edge of the misaligned corridor reported heavier fire from concealed positions. Their left flank, slightly exposed due to the earlier overextension, began absorbing pressure it was not equipped to withstand. Artillery requests multiplied, but the guns had not yet been repositioned to support the sector fully. Hours mattered, and the delay created a window of vulnerability. Communication lines became strained as units attempted to coordinate a response. Radio signals faded or overlapped, and field messengers took longer routes due to disrupted paths. Reports arrived unevenly, each adding a fragment to an increasingly urgent picture. The enemy had recognized the misalignment and was concentrating force precisely where support was weakest. If the pressure continued unaddressed, the entire forward position risked bending further and potentially collapsing inward. Nightfall offered no relief. Searchlights scanned the tree lines, revealing momentary silhouettes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The men along the corridor sensed the shift in tempo. The enemy was no longer testing, they were preparing. The gap, once a minor irregularity on the map, had become a strategic liability. Officers understood that a decisive action needed to be taken at dawn. The crisis was no longer theoretical, it was unfolding directly on the ground. As dawn broke, staff officers gathered around a modest command table, mapping the night's developments with sharpened clarity. The pattern was unmistakable. By advancing faster than their neighboring units, one regiment had unintentionally created a salient, an outward bulge that left its flanks exposed while stretching supporting formations thin. What appeared on earlier maps as an achievement of progress now revealed itself as a critical imbalance. The diagnosis focused on three elements. First, the salient's depth exceeded the supporting artillery's effective coverage, leaving forward companies vulnerable. Second, supply routes feeding the leading elements were too narrow and too long, restricting reinforcement and limiting their ability to respond quickly. Third, the enemy had begun massing forces opposite the salient's hinge point, the precise location where two formations failed to maintain alignment. This combination of factors turned the salient into a potential breach point. If the enemy succeeded in pushing inward at the hinge, they could isolate the forward regiment, cut off its supply line, and threaten the adjoining sector. The staff recognized the severity of the situation. Correcting the imbalance required more than simply pulling units back. That risked losing ground unnecessarily and conceding momentum. Instead, the solution demanded deliberate coordination, a controlled pivot of the line, reinforcing one flank, repositioning artillery, and adjusting the axis of advance could realign the entire sector. Such a maneuver needed precision and timing, carried out under pressure while maintaining cohesion between multiple units. The officers agreed that the corrective action would define the day's outcome. It was no longer a question of whether to act, but how quickly and effectively the realignment could be executed.
The maneuver began quietly, without the dramatic signals often associated with major shifts. Orders were relayed through runners and low-powered radios, instructing units to adjust their positions as the sun rose. Infantry on the salient's forward edge were told to hold their ground temporarily, while flanking elements prepared to reposition. This required discipline. Any premature movement might reveal the intent and encourage the enemy to strike before the realignment took shape. Artillery crews moved first. They hauled their guns along narrow forest tracks, using manpower and horse teams where trucks could not pass. Their objective was to establish overlapping fields of fire along the salient's hinge point, the weak spot the enemy had already begun to probe. Once the batteries were in place, they could provide the covering fire necessary to shield the adjustment. The infantry on the left flank executed the most delicate part of the maneuver. They advanced not to gain ground, but to create a stronger shoulder for the line. By stepping forward a limited distance, they shortened the salient's exposed edge and anchored the formation in terrain better suited for defense. Simultaneously, support elements tightened their formation behind them, reducing the gap that had previously allowed enemy reconnaissance teams to operate freely. Meanwhile, the right flank of the salient conducted a controlled pullback of several hundred meters. This withdrawal was synchronized to avoid creating new vulnerabilities. Engineers prepared temporary roadblocks and fallback points, ensuring that the shift did not devolve into confusion. Step by step, the two flanks moved toward each other, narrowing the salient and straightening the line. By late afternoon, the maneuver was nearly complete. The front line now formed a continuous, reinforced arc instead of an overextended protrusion. What began as a subtle correction evolved into a decisive reshaping of the sector, executed under pressure, but with remarkable control.
The effects of the maneuver became evident almost immediately. Enemy forces that had prepared to strike the salient's hinge point now faced a reorganized and reinforced line. Their anticipated target no longer existed. The weak corridor had been replaced with a solid front, supported by repositioned artillery and redistributed infantry. Probing attacks that had seemed promising the day before now encountered coordinated fire, making further advances costly. the strengthened left flank delivered the first significant setback to the enemy. With improved visibility and clear firing lines, they repelled several attempts to test the adjusted formation. The concentrated artillery fire, synchronized with infantry movements, disrupted enemy staging areas hidden along forest edges and low ridges. Scouts reported that the opposing force appeared uncertain, their earlier confidence eroded by the sudden stability. Supply routes benefited as well. The reshaped line shortened distances for fuel and ammunition deliveries, allowing convoys to reach forward units more efficiently. This increase in logistical reliability amplified the defensive strength of the sector, giving commanders greater flexibility in their operations. Units that had previously stretched their supplies thin now operated with a renewed sense of endurance. Perhaps the most significant impact came from the regained cohesion. Commanders could now issue orders with clearer expectations, knowing their formations were aligned consistently across the sector. The fear of a localized collapse dissipated. Instead, the reorganized line offered opportunities for measured advances and improved coordination with neighboring divisions. The maneuver, though modest in scale, prevented a potentially crippling setback. By addressing the imbalance at precisely the right moment, the sector not only held but strengthened its position. What had begun as a quiet correction became a turning point with strategic implications. The tactical adjustment made in 1941 did not become a celebrated event in the broader narrative of the war. It appeared in few official reports and received no special commendation. Yet, within the context of the front's daily struggles, it represented the essence of effective field command, recognizing a small flaw before it grew into a decisive failure. The legacy of the maneuver lay in its precision. It demonstrated the value of understanding terrain, unit alignment, and logistical endurance, not as abstractions, but as interconnected elements that define the success or failure of entire operations. The officers who implemented the shift did so without fanfare, guided not by bold ambition, but by a clear reading of the field and a disciplined approach to correction. Long after the front line moved elsewhere, veterans who served in the sector recalled the moment not as a dramatic battle, but as a day when coordination outweighed chaos. They remembered the movement of artillery along quiet tracks, the controlled repositioning of infantry, and the steady resolve that kept the line from bending under pressure. It was, in their view, a demonstration of how wars are often shaped, not by sweeping offensives alone, but by the careful, understated decisions that preserve stability in moments of uncertainty. Historians studying operational dynamics later identified the maneuver as an instructive example of tactical flexibility. It showed how small, well-timed actions could neutralize threats that might otherwise compromise an entire formation. Though rarely highlighted, the event became a case study in military academies for its clarity, and its reminder that even in fast-moving campaigns, attention to detail remains vital. In the vast landscape of 1941, where major operations drew most attention, this quiet shift stands as a testament to the importance of subtle corrections. It was a moment when understanding outweighed urgency, and a small adjustment ensured that the front held firm.